This is Western Civilization 1. I'm Dr. Young. Um, Today we're going to start talking about this period called the High Middle Ages, sometimes simply just called the Middle Ages. And by high, we mean the time at which the Middle Ages reached its greatest flourishing, where the institutions reached their kind of fullest development before the revolutionary changes that happened in the late Middle Ages. Um, and that can be misleading because we might assume from that people in Europe had a plan that they were trying to achieve, and that they, reached the realization of that plan at this point. The truth is that the development was really far more organic than that, and piecemeal and trial and error and all of that. So. And there were some people in this period who did kind of lay out plans for the creation of social structures and cultural things. And there is to some extent, a systematization of society and culture in the Middle Ages, and so that exists in tension with the more organic development here. But Europe did reach a point of cultural flourishing. And this is a period of tremendous creativity and vitality, where a lot of the institutions that we associate with old Europe, what is known as old Europe, or maybe the more common term is the French term ancien régime, the old regime previous to the French Revolution. Those structures were put in place mostly in this period that we call the High Middle Ages, in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. So this will take us to the end of our course, this discussion of the High Middle Ages. Today, in this lecture, I'm going to talk about social and economic development, and in later lectures, I will address the political development and the cultural development of Europe in this period. I want to start with a reference to the landscape of Europe, to demonstrate how creative and how vital social and cultural advancement was in the High Medieval period. Let's take a look at this shot. This is an aerial view of the Black Forest in southwestern Germany. And if you were to take a time machine back 1,000 years and take a walk across Europe, this is pretty much what you would find. Unbroken forest. Some of it coniferous, some of it deciduous, but pretty much lots of trees, with a few clearings here and there for fields and villages. But for the most part, the landscape, human beings did not dominate the landscape. They had not remade the landscape to fit human societies. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't anything going on. There actually was quite a bit going on, but the population of Europe had not risen to the point, and the society itself was not, so active as it would be in later centuries. Now, get back in your time machine and go forward 300 years, and this is the sort of thing you would see. The image on the left shows that the land has been cleared and put into cultivation with villages, interspersed all through the land. Many of these villages, maybe most of them by 1300, had a small parish church. And this is to say nothing of the cities, which I'll talk about in a few minutes here. And so a lot happened over those 300 years that can be sort of encapsulated in this complete clearing of the forests of Europe. Now, there were still some forests holding on, and even forests of medieval fame. The Black Forest is one. Sherwood Forest in England of Robin Hood fame is quite famous, although if you go to Sherwood Forest today, you'll see it's just a few acres of trees. There's really not much left of what used to be a relatively unbroken forest across the whole central swath of England. Right. Now, another thing that you would see by 1300 were lots and lots of towns. In fact, towns where there had been no towns previous to this time. This is an example of a medieval town, and I want you to notice a few things about this picture. This is in northern Italy, I believe. Maybe southern France, I can't remember exactly. But you can see up here that there is some kind of stone keep. This is the earliest layer of development of this town. So somebody built a permanent residence there, probably a noble, and the town developed as people moved in and occupied positions in the keep here as laborers, as craftsmen, and to supply the needs of the lord who built this castle. And then, around that town, then, or I should say around the keep, which is on the top of the hill, there developed, more residences and shops and things like this. And this just continued to expand down the hill until at some point in this period, they built a wall around all of that. Okay. And enclosed the whole city now, or town at least, inside of a wall system for defensive purposes. And cities that are built on hills, as many of these medieval cities are very good for this purpose. That you have kind of the high point in the center. You build a wall around the hilly area, and it's difficult to attack because you have to attack from below, and the defenders of the city can stand on the walls and throw stones and arrows and things at the potential invaders, right? But even the wall system is not sufficient to contain the growth of many of these towns, and they develop other layers, and in some cases there are even more wall systems. You can see that there are a few buildings outside of the medieval walls of this town here, right? So that's the organic development of these towns, and so this isn't something that is planned necessarily from the beginning. They just grow up around some sort of center. They have a reason for existing and a reason for people moving there and taking up residence there and doing business there, right? So we've got development in the rural space and development in the urban space, and I want to address each of those in more detail as we go on here, right? And there's a great deal of creativity. That's the other thing that should be said. A great deal of creativity in both the rural setting and the urban setting, okay? So I want to talk about some of this creativity and vitality in the rural setting here. One of the evidences of that is the clearing of land. That was often done by adventurous peasants who wanted to put more land under cultivation. They may have had some kind of sponsorship from a noble, perhaps, who hired them, and there are lots of cases of that in the medieval record. But the peasants, have this entrepreneurial spirit, and they clear more land if they know if they can clear, some of these trees, and they can put more land under cultivation, have a greater food supply, potentially even a surplus that they can sell. And so, these sorts of motivations were very strong in the Middle Ages, and the development is sort of proof of that. Another manifestation of this rural creativity is the institution called the fair. If you have ever been to a county fair or a state fair or something like that, which is really a cultural spectacle in the United States, and if you haven't been, you really should go at some point, if only to experience that culture and, eat an elephant ear or a funnel cake, and ride the super loop or the zipper or whatever kind of funky rides they have that are ubiquitous at these things. Well, those are the distant descendants of an institution that began in the Middle Ages. It was an institution for people to bring their surplus goods and to sort of show off the wares, the produce that their village had produced, and to trade with each other, right? And with that trading went forms of entertainment. So if we can conduct a little thought experiment here, say we have, a hypothetical village in the Middle Ages in the French countryside or something like that, and one year they have a big bumper crop of wheat, right? And so they realize they've got more than they need to eat, and more, they've got enough for the seeds for the next year to plant, plus plenty of food, and so they say, well, this is just going to spoil if we leave it around here. Let's see if we can figure out something to do with it. So, some enterprising youths from the village get a cart, and they load a bunch of this wheat onto the cart, and they set out across, on a forest path somewhere. And they come across another group of villagers who happen to also have a really good year and have a surplus of things. And these guys have taken that wheat, and maybe some hops and barley and things, and they have brewed up a batch of beer. And the guys who have the wheat say, well, hey, why don't we trade our wheat for your beer? And they come to some arrangement to exchange and pull off this transaction. And both of them say, the groups say, this worked out really well for us. Why don't we meet up here the same time next year and trade again, right? But then the word spreads, and the next year 4 villages show up to this place, to this crossroads in the middle of the forest. And then they eventually clear up a sort of place out so that this can get larger, and this could develop into a regional fair, or maybe even a fair that is attended internationally. So that was, and that's a hypothetical, right? I'm not talking about any specific case, but you can see from that thought experiment how this might have happened. We have some documents here that are assigned text for this week that give an indication of the growth of fairs. This first one is from Sweden. And this source notes that in Svithjod, which is a region of southern Sweden, it was the old custom, as long as heathenism prevailed, in other words, as long as these people were not converted to Christianity yet, that the chief sacrifice took place in Goe month at Uppsala. So the sacrifice probably to Odin or Thor or one of these other Norse gods, right? Then sacrifice was offered for peace and victory to the king, and thither came people from all parts of Svithjod. So there was this religious festival held in the city or the town of Uppsala, and people came from all over the place to attend the religious festival, but some other things happened as well. For instance, next sentence, all the things of the Swedes also were held here. Well, what are all the things? Well, if you remember back to the previous lecture on the Vikings, the thing was their kind of parliament system. Where all of the prominent men would come together and debate the issues of the day and reach some decisions about that, right? So they held the things. And they also had markets and meetings for buying, which continued for a week. And this continued after Christianity took hold in Sweden. It was no longer a religious festival to the Norse gods, but instead became a kind of Christian festival, as these things were wont to do, right? And the fair, so the fair grew up in association with this religious and political festival, right? So that's another way that these festivals could be, or these fairs, I should say, could take shape, right? In some cases, the fairs were so lucrative that the political leaders wanted to regulate them. This is from 13th century England. Where Henry III, the King of England, tries to establish a new fair in Westminster, okay? And this fair would last for 2 weeks, as it said, for a fortnight entire. That's 2 weeks. And he also strictly interdicted, under penalty of heavy forfeiture and loss, all fairs which usually lasted for such a length of time in England. So there had been some other fairs. He says, no, I want to start this fair in Westminster, and it's the only one that can last for 2 weeks. And he tries to incentivize the merchants to come to this fair, right? It doesn't seem that they were very happy about this because the weather was not great in Westminster. It's kind of a swampy area. It's windy. There's lots of rain everywhere in England, but especially in this part. Westminster, by the way, was in what is now West London, where the Houses of Parliament are now, and not coincidentally, this just happened to be right next to the main residence of Henry himself. So it's understandable why he wanted to hold this fair. He wanted access to it. He also wanted to regulate it, and especially to tax the merchants there. They were not thrilled with this, but he was the king, and so he made this decree, right? So that's another way that fairs could take shape or develop. The most popular fairs in all of Western Europe were held in the northeastern French county known as Champagne or Champagne. These were held in summer. They lasted for a couple of weeks, and people came from all over the world to attend these things. I mean all over the world by saying, what I mean by that is not just people in France or just in Western Europe, but it seems that people probably came from the Byzantine Empire, possibly even from the Muslim lands, to trade there. All sorts of things were available, entertainment of every kind, and this was the social and economic occasion of the year, so to speak, all over France. So the fair is one mark or one piece of evidence for the kind of creativity that existed in the rural space. These things sort of founded probably by peasants and largely formulated to cater to their needs. There are other marks of creativity in the rural space. And the word peasant, I may have explained this before, but peasant really is just a catch-all term for poor rural worker, agriculturalist, right, farmer. There were different kinds of peasants in the Middle Ages, some of them free, some of them unfree, some who owned their own land, some who were sharecroppers. The peasants is really just the catch-all term for that, okay? So that's not a category that is really definite. And this is not the class to go into the subcategories of peasants, all right? Suffice it to say that they did live in what we would consider relatively primitive or simple circumstances. They lived in simple dwellings, usually only 1 or 2 rooms, wattle and daub architecture, so slats that were driven into the ground, maybe a hole dug for the foundation. The slats were then filled in with dirt, mud, manure, other things to insulate it, and then the roof is made of thatch, which is just straw. Thatch is actually, if you pack it tight enough, if you have a skilled thatcher, then it's waterproof, but it does attract a lot of vermin. It's also tremendously flammable, and so thatch is a decent roofing material, but it needs to be replaced every few years, maybe even every couple of years. Peasants worked very hard, not only on their own. Not only in the fields, where they spent much of their time, but on their own homesteads. They tended to have gardens where they grew vegetables and herbs and things like that, which was really the only variation in diet that they had. They did not eat a lot of meat because meat was expensive, and most of the meat product, the animals, that is, the pigs and cattle and other things, were owned by nobles, by lords. Okay, so the peasants didn't get those kinds of things probably very often. However, despite living in these, difficult circumstances, primitive circumstances, and working extremely hard, they still did creative things. They invented things that ended up impacting not only their own lives, but the lives of generations of people in the Middle Ages. So I'm going to talk about 3 agricultural innovations over the next few minutes here. I realize this is not probably the most exciting topic for many of you, but it's still quite important and has a pretty dramatic impact on the society of medieval Europe. Okay, so the first of these is a new style of plow. This is the ancient style of plow. This is the sort of thing that would have been used in the Roman Empire, for instance. It's really just a sharpened stick right here that is attached to a plow beam, and the plow beam would then be hooked up to probably an animal of some kind, most likely an ox, possibly even a pig or something. It just depends. Human beings could have pulled this too, I suppose. The plowshare is the thing that actually digs into the soil and tries to break up the soil so that it's soft and can be planted in. The plow staff is the thing that the farmer uses to push the plowshare into the ground to cause the damage to the soil. Now, just being a sharpened stick, and because metal was fairly scarce, probably these peasants didn't work frequently with metal plows, right? These things are prone to break. You're probably going to go through, multiple plowshares over the course of any given season, just doing the planting. So, they had a time to, I mean, it was one of their tasks was to make sure that their equipment was available, right? Now, at some point in the Middle Ages, and it's uncertain when or who came up with this, but they invented a new style of plow. Okay, so you can see on the lower left here, the plow. This plow was known in Latin as the carruca. That's a term that I actually want you to know. I apologize that it's not on the slide here. Carruca is how that's spelled. That you may see that on an exam. Okay. As an identification term. So this is the carruca. And you can see that it looks a lot different from that ancient scratch plow up there, right? First of all, it's much heavier. It's much larger. And it has a metal plowshare right here. This is the thing that digs into the soil. There also would be a horizontal share that would cut and lift the soil at the roots of whatever is planted in it and turn it over. This thing is called the mold board. So the soil would be thrown up by the coulter or the horizontal share, and it would hit the mold board and flip over. And so you end up with this undulating pattern of rows and furrows. It also has wheels because this whole thing is quite heavy and needs the stability of wheels. This is the plow staff, and so this is what the farmer is going to be using. Given that this thing is quite heavy, it would probably take multiple animals to pull this, maybe even 4, 6, or possibly even 8 oxen or horses to pull this thing, right? But this is the kind of mechanism that can be used to plow even thick soils with a high clay content, even soils that have tough roots and things in them. This plow is going to be able to handle that. And it gave the peasants the opportunity to plow and to put into cultivation land that had been previously unavailable, marginal land that would have been difficult to work otherwise, right? So more land in cultivation means more food and more prosperity, more of everything. A second innovation was the horse as a as a draft animal. It might seem strange that only in the Middle Ages did people first start to use horses in earnest as draft animals. Well, it's because people in the ancient world don't seem to have figured out the horse's anatomy, the way that a horse works, specifically where its windpipe is. We have these comments in ancient works and even some ancient illustrations of these poor horses with their heads thrown back, gasping for air because people were trying to use the same sort of device on horses that they used on cattle. Just a yoke that goes over their backs and has a strap that attaches around their neck. For an ox, that's not a problem because the ox has a trachea, a windpipe that's very deep inside of its neck, but a horse has a trachea that's right on the surface, and so these horses would choke. Well, in the Middle Ages, and again, we don't know who did this. There is no equivalent of a Thomas Edison or anything like that, somebody who is a named person, a named inventor. But probably some peasants just kind of experimenting with different options, came up with a collar that fits the horse on the shoulders rather than the neck. Even has a space here. This is not a very good illustration, but it does come from a medieval manuscript. And I like it for a couple of reasons here. As you can see that this collar fits on the shoulder of the horse rather than pull at its neck up here or something like that. And suddenly the horse was a better draft animal than anything that they had used before. I like this illustration because here's the poor ox over here, kind of looking on at the horses who have taken his job, right? I don't know if that's really the intention, but that's an unintended image of sorts, and it works really well for our purposes. Horses can pull just as much as an ox. They can do it faster, and once the plowing is done, then a person could unhitch the horse from its horse collar and jump on its back and ride it to and from the fields, right? So people could live further away from the fields than they had before. Thus, more land in cultivation, more effective farming techniques. The third farming technique was a crop rotation system. Um, in the ancient world, people did figure out that if you plant the same crops in the same land year after year, that pretty soon the nutrients are going to be depleted. And so they began to leave roughly half of the available farmland fallow in any given year, right? They would not plant anything in it so that the nutrients of the soil could replenish. The problem was that most people living in what is now Europe um, would plant the sorts of crops that drew a lot of nutrients out of the soil, specifically grain crops that had to be planted in the late fall and lay in the ground over the winter during the period when the snow is on the ground. And then they would begin to grow in the spring. They would grow through the spring and summer and be harvested in late summer or early autumn, and then the whole cycle starts over again. The planting in the late autumn, and back to the laying in the ground over the winter and everything. Most grains, or a lot of grains, require that long a germination cycle. Okay, and these, because they're in the ground much longer, they draw a lot of nutrients from the soil. Okay, now, in the Middle Ages, peasant farmers figured out a couple of things. First of all, they figured out that they could plant other crops that would replenish some of the nutrients that grain crops took out of the soil. Specifically things that would be planted in the spring and have a much shorter growing season. We're talking about legumes and peas and some variations of grain that had these shorter growing seasons. And so the wheat crops lived in a kind of symbiosis with these crops that had shorter cycles, and they would also leave part of the land fallow. So you end up with three different crop rotations: fallow, the autumn planting, that is the winter wheat crops, and the spring, the legumes and other things, right? So this means there are a number of consequences to this. First of all, the diet is more varied and more healthy. These legumes and things tend to have higher protein content in them than just your standard grain crops, which are pure carbohydrates. And so they're getting some protein, also some vitamins and minerals. It's putting some nutrients back in the soil that are needed for planting the grain crops. And if you just look at this at simple mathematics here, you now have 2/3 of the land in cultivation instead of just half. And they would rotate this, right? So this one in this hypothetical year is spring, and this one's autumn, and this one's fallow. But the next year they move the fallow to here, and the spring to here, and the autumn to here, right? And that meant more food and a healthier diet, right? This, by the way, let me pause and comment. This is a term that you've already seen up to this point. That is the term manor. This is a pretty good hypothetical illustration of a manor. This is not meant to represent any specific village or manor. But you can see here the manor house, which would be the residence of the lord or of his representative. A lot of lords held land, held manors that they did not live on. They were absentee landlords, as it were. Rather, they would appoint an official of some kind to live in the manor house and administer the land. And this is actually where we get some of the terms that are still common in usage, so their meanings have changed. The word sheriff comes originally from the English word shire. A shire was another term for village or manor in England in the Middle Ages. And there are lots of places that are called that have the shire designation on the end. So you get Lincolnshire and Cheshire and Worcestershire and other places like that, right? The shire, not to be confused with hobbits and things like that, although that's actually demonstrative of the kind of thing we're looking at, was a manor like this, right? So sheriff was originally the shire reeve, the reeve being the chief administrator over that shire, right? And that eventually is just sort of thrown together and becomes shire reeve becomes sheriff. And so the sheriff, today is a law enforcement official. In previous eras, the sheriff was a kind of rural land administrator. So you got the manor house here, and the lord of the manor would also own a number of other things, and would charge the peasants for the use of them. So the mill for milling grain. This was a contentious point. There were places in Europe in the Middle Ages that made it illegal for people to own their own millstones, right? And they enforced this pretty vehemently. The lords wanted the peasants to pay to get their grain ground. A barn, an oven, all of these things, even the bridge here. Many lords charged tolls for allowing the peasants to cross the bridge if they wanted to leave the village. The lord would probably also build the church and supply the parson, the priest, who would administer the local parish. Most of the inhabitants of the manor would live in the village, in small houses that were a fraction the size of the manor house, and they would eke out their existence here. And the lord frequently did also own sort of set aside forest land for his own use, for grazing pigs on, for instance, or for hunting. Peasants who were caught hunting on the lord's land, that's called poaching, would be prosecuted, possibly even executed for that. Okay. And peasants would have to work both the lord's land and their own land in this hypothetical thing, right? So some of this land belongs to the lord, some of it is sharecropped or owned outright by peasants, and so they all exist in these really tight relationships with each other. Okay, so that's more or less how a manor worked, and this is all hypothetical and very general, but I think hopefully for our purposes you get the picture there. Now, turning our attention to the the urban space, we should comment also on the creativity and vitality of towns in this period. Towns were great engines of growth. They were the result, partially, of growth. The population of Europe exploded in this period, partly because of the rural innovations, like these three things that I've talked about: the plow and the horse collar and the crop rotation system. And people needed places to live, and they would often settle in places that came to have large population agglomerations. And so that's how we end up with towns. There are lots and lots of new towns founded in the Middle Ages. You can see this in the landscape. If you travel across Europe, you're going to see lots and lots of towns with names like Villeneuve in French, which means new town, or Neustadt in German, also meaning new town, or even Newton in England, right, which means new town. Same name, different languages. Those were all towns that were founded in the Middle Ages, probably in the high medieval period that we're talking about here. These towns were, I like to say, rips in the social fabric of Europe. Because in the rural space, the peasants had closely defined relationships with their lords. They were dependent on the lords. The laws were enforced quite strictly there. Peasants had dues and taxes and tithes and tolls and other things they had to pay to their lords. They had to provide labor for them. All of those things were set out, and each peasant knew what he was supposed to do, and they had rituals periodically that would back this up, where the lord would go to his manor and gather all of his peasants together, and they would swear allegiance to him and sort of re-up the commitments that they had made, they or their ancestors had made to that lord or to his ancestors. And so all of these things were fairly standardized, right? But in the town, different rules applied, because towns generated money. Most of the people who lived in towns were of the same status as the rural peasants. Many of them came from small villages in the rural space. There were even laws established in the Middle Ages, more customary than actual de jure laws, that stated that if a person, if a peasant, a serf, an unfree peasant, escapes from his village and manages to stay away for a year and a day, that day is important, you got to throw that in there, then they would be considered free. They would no longer owe the obligations they owed previously to their lord. That was, again, a sort of customary law that existed in parts of Europe. Now, there are also sayings like in German, Stadtluft macht frei, which means city air makes free. People had this impression that if you go to the city, there will be economic opportunity there. And there were for a lot of people. Probably not for the majority of the town who lived in probably great poverty. But some people got rich when they went to towns because they were skilled at a craft, or they figured out some sort of market for selling goods in, or they came up with some kind of innovation that was in high demand. And these peasants who now are townsmen thus could use their money as leverage to change the way society worked, to change the obligations they owed to their lords, right? And to experiment politically with town government and other things in ways that were not possible in the rural space. So let's talk about town government for a minute. All right, there are a number of innovations in this period, and this is not an exhaustive list, but for one, there was a whole movement in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries for townsmen to establish what are called communes. That is, these are like, the term that's used today is collective bargaining agreements. You hear that in like sports and other things where you have these players' unions, and you'd also hear it in sort of labor economics and things like this. But a collective bargaining agreement is basically where all the people involved in a community sort of pool their identities together and approach, in the case of the Middle Ages, their lord or some entity, and bargain collectively with that entity. To give you a good modern example, if this is not clear, health insurance is almost always a collective bargaining agreement. So, for instance, I am employed by Flagler College, and Flagler College probably has a couple hundred employees, and we don't each go to Blue Cross Blue Shield or whoever is the current health insurance provider. We go as a collective, right? We have a negotiator who represents us and says, here is the general health profile of the 200 employees of Flagler College. What sort of deal will you give us for the health profile? Now, the important thing there is, and the reason that it works like this is because each person has, of course, a different health history and different health issues. If each person goes on their own, some people will get a really good rate from the insurance company. Others will get a terrible rate. If I have had, if I have several chronic health issues, if I have hypertension and diabetes and obesity and these other things, and I've had, 5 heart attacks or whatever, then the health insurance company is going to say, in order to insure you, you've got to pay, hundreds of thousands of dollars every month. But, if that one person with a bad health history or bad genetics is in a pool with a bunch of healthy people, then everybody's premiums are lower, right? Because it's done collectively. Well, sorry for that little excursion into health insurance here, although I think it's valuable for you to know this as students. You're going to head into the real world at some point, right? And some of you are already there. In any case, this is how towns worked in the Middle Ages vis-a-vis their relationship with the lords. Okay, each of these people owed certain obligations individually to their lords, but if they bargained collectively, they knew they could get a better deal. And so these townsmen would gather together a bunch of money. They would approach the rural lord, who technically was the overseer of their town, and say to him, here's a bunch of money, take it and leave us alone. Let us govern ourselves, right? We'll pay our obligations to you as a collective, sort of take it or leave it, right? Here's a bunch of money. And these lords would say, well, that saves me the trouble. of having to go track down every single one of these townsmen and figure out what they owe me every year for taxes and tolls and things like this, right? So that's a commune. Now, there were critics of the communal movement in the Middle Ages, so I'll come back to some of these other things. This is a source from a guy named Guibert of Nogent. He was a monk in northern France in the early 12th century. He was from a noble family. He eventually rose to the position of abbot in his monastery, so he was a person of some regional importance. He's really quite interesting because he wrote what amount to a kind of memoir of his life, or some things that happened in his life in any case. And one of the things that he comments upon is the activities of the commune in the city of Laon, which was a rather prominent town that was near where he lived, near where his abbey was. The people of Laon formed a commune, and they ended up in a severe argument with the count over that area. And this ultimately erupted into violence. And Guibert is looking at this from the vantage point of his monastery and being a noble, and kind of looking on with some disdain, some disgust at what these townspeople, these poor people, as he saw them, these lower class people, were doing. And so he says, now commune is a new and a bad name of an arrangement for all the poorest classes to pay their usual due of servitude to their lords once only in the year, and to make good any breach of the laws they have committed by the payment fixed by law, and to be entirely free from all other exactions usually imposed on serfs. So you can see here that the townspeople want independence, so they pay the lord off so that he will give them independence. The people, seizing on this opportunity for freeing themselves, gathered huge sums of money to fill the gaping mouths of so many greedy men. The greedy men in this case are the lords. These are Guibert's peers as nobles, right? They, pleased with the shower poured upon them, took oaths binding themselves in the matter, and Guibert is rather disgusted with this. Okay, that independence in government was tremendously important to these towns. Thus, they were able to experiment with different economic innovations and different forms of social organization that would have been impossible outside of the urban space. Another experiment with town government happened mostly in Italy, where the largest towns in all of Europe were located. Northern Italy was the most urbanized, the most highly populated region of all of Western Europe. And these towns often were kind of riven with factions. If you read Dante's Divine Comedy, you'll note, if some of you may have read some of that, you may note that Dante, in the late 13th century, was part of a political faction in the city of Florence, and they were fighting with another political faction. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is based in a 13th century Italian city. And so, these contentions and corruptions that existed in these cities were a real hindrance to the progress of the city. And so many of these Italian cities came up with a new form of government, which was government by a figure called the podestà. Podestà was a kind of city manager. They would be hired by the city to clean up the city's fiscal situation, their finances, their system of political organization and everything, pretty much the whole government. And they would be given, salaries over a period of years. They would contract with the cities. There were some men who developed such a reputation that they ended up being hired by several cities over the course of a career. They might start out in, say, Genoa and be 3 or 4 years as podestà there, and then, end up in Pisa for a while, and then in Florence, and then maybe back to Genoa. These are all hypotheticals, but there were some men, it seems, who were very good at this. In fact, all of the forms of city or government organization that exist in the modern day pretty much trace their origins back to the Middle Ages. Mayors and city councils. The podestà is like a city manager, right? And there would have been, trustees who appointed the podestà from all of the prominent families in the city. And so all of these innovations date back to the Middle Ages. Okay. Now you can see from this map of medieval Paris here how some of this took shape, how these cities grew, and we already talked about this to some extent, but Paris is a city that dates back to the Roman period, but it was built up again in the Middle Ages. It had fallen into mostly dehabitation in late antiquity, but by 1300 or so, it had tens of thousands of people in it. The city center is around what is known as the Ile de la Cité, this island out in the middle of the Seine. And you have the right bank and the left bank here, okay, and the walls would have been around those, okay. So the cathedral was on the Ile de la Cité. You can see Notre Dame here, and the palace of the kings of France was up here. We'll talk about that later. It's the place of what is now the Louvre, and the university eventually is down here. I'll talk about that in a moment. The Louvre is right there. Okay, so that was originally not an art museum. It was a palace of the kings. Now, there are other institutions here as well. You can see that there are lots of religious institutions. You have the Cathedral of Notre Dame. You also have the Priory of Saint-Martin. You have the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. You have the Abbey of Saint Victor, the Abbey of Saint-Geneviève, and so forth and so on. Okay, these are all important religious institutions. And you can see the walls that developed around the city, and then the further development outside of the walls and all of that, right? So Paris is a very good example of this, how these cities developed. Another innovation that we see in the urban space is the institution called the guild, right? And this description of these cities sort of sets this up. Guilds were organizations of people who did the same job in order to regulate those jobs and to make sure that the quality of goods being produced was high, and that the people who belonged to the guild had an advantage in that market. There were craft guilds or artisan guilds, and so all of the shoemakers in the city, the cobblers, it's another name for shoemaker, would form a guild. All of the blacksmiths in the city would form a guild. All of the tanners, that is those who work with leather, would form a guild. And all of the coopers in the city, the barrel makers, in other words, would form a guild, and so forth and so on, right? And the purpose of a craft guild was to really to protect the interests of those who were invested in that business. The craft guilds regulated quality of finished product. They also regulated prices to make sure that the price remains high enough that people don't have to kill themselves to make a living doing that craft. They regulated the production of goods to keep it at a level that did not mean that the price would drop precipitously, right? It's kind of like a cartel in that way. And so they keep the price artificially high. Only those who belong to the guild in many of these cities could actually participate in that craft. Others would be excluded from this, and guilds were often tightly bound up with the city authorities, and thus could put pressure on anyone who was trying to break into that market. Beyond craft guilds also regulated access to the profession. And so the craft guilds would come up with a system of education where guild masters would take on apprentices. The apprentices would serve for a period of some years while they learned their craft in the shop of their master. Then they would be given a degree, the degree of journeyman, which meant, as the name indicates, that they could move out of their initial shop and go off and serve some other master and work for a higher pay grade, as it were. And then they might be able to eventually become a guild master. In order to become a guild master, one had to truly perfect one's craft, had to demonstrate that by producing a master work. And increasingly, these were political positions, and one had to have connections in order to break into full guild membership. In other words, to become a guild master, right? And so that's one of the things that leads to the corruption of the guild system. There's only a few people really are in charge of what's going on in the guild. Beyond craft guilds, there were also merchant guilds, which regulate basically the same things, quality and price and all of that. But in this case, they don't make their own finished products. They procure them in other ways. And so there were merchant guilds of merchants who dealt in the same kind of goods. So the Textile Merchants Guild or the Grocers Guild or the Haberdashers Guild or something like that. So these were common features of the Middle Ages in these towns. There were some guilds that were dominated by women. Beer brewing, actually, was almost an entirely female procedure in the Middle Ages. Women were the ones who did this, and so the guilds of ale brewers were usually entirely female guilds. Guilds provided the only form of social security or welfare that existed in the Middle Ages. The guilds would provide for their fellow guild members, would take care of, for instance, their funeral expenses, would even, if a guild member died with dependents, with a wife and children, would provide some sort of income for the dependents of that now deceased guild member. And so these performed a number of functions. I've left out one guild, which I'll have more to say about in a later lecture in this class. But that is the Guild of Scholars that grew up in some of these cities. Okay, and this is an important innovation as well. In fact, tremendously important. You can see again in Paris here, there are lots of religious institutions. Well, each of these religious institutions, whether we're talking about the monasteries of Saint-Germain and Saint-Geneviève, or the House of Canons. This is a different kind of clergyman. I'm not going to go into the details there, but the Abbey of St. Victor, or the Cathedral of Notre Dame here in the city center. All of these are religious institutions, and they all provided education for clergymen in training, people who were training to become priests and monks, still novices. Here they would be taught, how to read, how to write, certainly the tenets of theology and other things, largely borrowing from the liberal arts tradition established in monasteries in the early Middle Ages, but eventually breaking into sort of the higher study of some of these disciplines. Well, in Paris and in other towns, these different institutions who provided education decided at some point in the High Middle Ages to sort of get together and pool their resources and allow students who were resident of the Cathedral School of Notre Dame, for instance, to go and listen to lectures given by one of the famous canons of St. Victor, like Hugh or Richard or Andrew, or these are all important scholars in this period, or to go off to the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés and hear the abbot preach or something like that, and that they would get credit, as it were, for attending these lectures. That would count toward their course of study and the degree they were seeking, right, or the position they were seeking. Well, this partnership eventually ended up as the university. That was the term for it, right? And universities were an innovation of the Middle Ages. Paris is one of the two earliest universities in Western Europe. The other was in the city of Bologna in northern Italy. And these universities developed a reputation for specific kinds of study. All of them provided a basic liberal arts education, but beyond that, graduates of that liberal arts program, who by the way achieved the rank of bachelor, would then have the option to pursue a higher course of study in a specific discipline, whether medicine or law or theology, and those were the three most common. Paris developed the highest reputation for the study of theology, and Bologna was especially renowned for the study of law. Others for medicine. Montpellier in southern France and Salerno in Italy were the most famous medical schools in the Middle Ages. And Oxford and Cambridge and these others in England developed a reputation for philosophy, and especially what they called natural philosophy. What we would call science was pursued at a very high level by these scholars in Western Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. Right. So that's another guild. These scholars would form a guild, and this would regulate, education, access to that profession, and all of that, and also degrees, right? Just as there were degrees in the craft guilds, there were also degrees at universities, not apprentice and journeyman and master in this case, but bachelor and master, and eventually the degree of doctorate, which required lots and lots of years of study. Last innovation of towns, let me look, yeah, okay, so this is it. Just had to check and make sure there wasn't something else. Was in the field of currency. Now, that's the last one I'm going to talk about in any case, right? Currency is an important economic institution, and in the Middle Ages, the currency systems of Western Europe were highly localized and complex. There were no universal currencies necessarily. Each town and each kingdom, and in some cases each major authority, both ecclesiastical and secular authorities, would issue their own currency. And this gets tremendously complicated. So let's pick a region, all right? Let's take northern Germany, for instance, which is where the documents that you were required to read on this for this week come from. The cities of Hamburg and Lübeck. And so, in that area, there were dukes and counts who were issuing their own currencies. There were also cities who were issuing their own currencies, and there were powerful archbishoprics along the Rhine River in Cologne and other cities who were also issuing currencies, right? The example here is from Henry III of England. You can see Henricus Rex, and then the Roman numeral 3, right? Henry III. And so, the king or the emperor is also issuing currency. And the question is, okay, which of these have value in which places, right? It could be devilishly difficult for a craftsman or a merchant who was who was resident in one city but trying to form a partnership or a relationship with some craftsman or merchant in another city to buy the goods from that other city with the currency from his own city, right? Because each city or each entity who produces currency uses their own weight of precious metals. Some of them are intrinsically worth more than others. The exchange rates, would have been not favorable if a person is taking one currency from one place to another, because normally, say, back to our two examples, a coin from Hamburg would not be recognized as legitimate currency in Lübeck. It's only recognized for the intrinsic value it has in the gold or silver or whatever precious metal it has. And so they would melt it down and, mint new coins or produce something else out of it, right? So you can see the problems with this. Well, one of the innovations in the Middle Ages was to come up with agreements like the one that you should have read in the document between Hamburg and Lübeck, where the two cities, who were part of a larger trade network called the Hanseatic League, but we're not going to get into that, came to an agreement where each city would mint their coins with the same weight of precious metal and the same size, right? So they would be interchangeable, and the currency of Hamburg would be recognized in Lübeck, and the currency of Lübeck would be recognized in Hamburg, and thus the two cities could have a smooth functioning economic relationship, right? We also begin to get currencies that were accepted far and wide. The most prominent cities in Europe, especially the cities of northern Italy, began to issue currencies that were respected all over the place. The city of Venice issued a currency called the ducat, and ducats were recognized, many places in Europe, just about everywhere, because everyone knew that, Venice was going to mint its coins with legitimate precious metals and that it would back up its currency. Florence, another prominent city, produced the florin, which was a near universal currency. You may recognize some of these names from plays by Shakespeare or other cultural references, right? There wasn't a truly universal currency in Europe, at least until the 16th century, when the Spanish, having discovered lands that were very rich in silver in the New World, especially in Bolivia, in a place called Potosi, began to mint coins, Spanish reals as they were called, that were pure silver. And these were used all over the place. Everyone would take Spanish reals. Even, I mean, these are even accepted in places like China and Japan in the early modern period. So, that it's not until later that we get a real universal currency. Like, the U.S. dollar is basically the universal currency today. It has value all over the world. In some places, even far-flung places, merchants will accept dollars because they know that that is legitimately backed by the U.S. government. Okay. All right, so those are some of the key innovations in the urban space and the rural space. And this economic growth and population growth that results from all of this innovation is key to the vitality and creativity. And we're going to see that vitality manifest in the political realm and in the cultural realm in the next couple of lectures. Thanks.